welcome to Gardening in 58 North. So in this video I'd like to show you how to grow chives on a windowsill and how you can grow them from seed. Now you can use this instruction I'm going to use today either specifically for a windowsill, or you can use it more generally growing it in a house, or even growing it in the garden as well if you want to grow it from seed. So when it comes to growing chives, it's a very easy plant to grow. It's a perennial plant as well, so it should last for years and years. You can keep cutting it back again and again and it will just keep responding well and regrowing lots of new leaves. It's a plant that really doesn't ever die unless it's been neglected. It should just keep on growing again and again. If not like some herbs and vegetables, which once they're finished they kind of go over. Hives, they'll just keep cropping continually. So it's quite a good plant. Once you've sown it once, you don't need to really normally sow it again unless it succumbs to disease or pests. So chives are in the allium family, so they're related to garlic and leeks and onions, which gives it the fantastic oniony taste. Because of that, they like a kind of cooler climate, so households can be a little bit warm for them at times, but luckily chives are quite an adaptable plant. They'll grow well in a cool environment. They'll also grow well in quite a warm environment. But if you're growing them in a household environment, try and keep it around the 20-degree mark. They don't like it when it gets above 30. They really don't like tropical weather. So ideally you would keep it around the 20-degree mark. And because they're not a tropical plant, it's important to know that they don't naturally grow year round. So with chives, what they do is they normally die back in winter time and then they'll grow again in summer and spring. The chives, they are a herbaceous plant, so they'll have their leaves in the summer months. In the winter months they'll go completely dormant and they'll die back to their roots. So quite often you might think your chives have died, but they've actually just died down to their roots. They're just being dormant and they'll come back next spring. So that's often a problem that can happen when growing it in a household environment, is you're trying to give it summer conditions because you're giving it warm, heated conditions. It goes into winter and the light levels are telling it should go dormant, but the temperatures are telling it should keep growing. The plant can get quite confused and it just kind of gets quite weak, and it can, if you keep it for more than 1 year and you don't give it a good dormant period where you let it get cold and it goes completely dormant, it can really struggle to grow the next year. So if you do want your chives to grow their best, put them outside in winter, let them get some frost, let them die back underground, have a couple of months where they're completely dormant in the cold weather, and they'll grow much stronger for that in spring. If you live somewhere that is tropical, you don't have winter months, or if you're living in a house where you don't have a garden where you can put them outside in the winter months, what you can do is you can grow them from seed each year, and that way they'll grow well for probably about 6 to 8 months, and then after about that time they'll start to want to go naturally dormant and they might start to struggle a bit. Often you can get them to grow for more than 1 year if you're in a warming environment, but generally they'll get weaker and you'll need to re-sow them. So in this video I'm going to show you how to sow the seeds. They're quite easy plants, as I say. They're not too fussy when it comes to the temperatures, and they're not too fussy when it comes to watering as well, as long as they're kept quite damp. So before you sow your seeds, you need to think about the type of compost you're going to use. I would recommend using a multi-purpose compost. That way the plants should grow quite healthily once they germinate, and also they'll germinate quite well. You can use seed and cutting compost and you might get slightly better germination, but the growth will be quite weak unless you repot them, and there's a lot more work having to then put them into new, richer compost. So I would just start off with some quite rich compost, such as multi-purpose compost. However, when you look at the compost, a lot of multi-purpose compost will say it can feed the plants for up to 6 months. Try to avoid these ones. These ones have very high feed and they're not very suitable for seeds. Just go for a normal multi-purpose compost that might feed for 6 weeks instead of 6 months, and that way you're less likely to burn the roots. When it comes to sowing chives, the way that they grow naturally in the wild makes it a little bit easier. A lot of plants you need to make sure they have the correct spacing, but with chives they grow a bit like grass. There's just loads of little shoots. So when it comes to the sowing of the seeds, you don't need to worry too much about the spacings, and generally I would say to sow extra just to make sure you get a good coverage. If you don't sow enough, all that will happen is it'll be quite a sparse germination, and it'll take longer for the pot to fill. But what will happen is the plant will send up lots of little side shoots, and eventually it will completely fill the pot naturally. So I'll show you the seeds now, and the seeds can be quite hard to see when you have them on the compost. They're fairly small. They're not the smallest seeds out there, but they are quite small, and they're black as well, which makes it very hard to see on the compost, but you can see them there. They're very similar appearance to black onion seeds or nigella seeds. quite small, and so when you're handling them it can be a little bit tricky. So I'm going to go ahead and plant this pot up now. It's about a 15 centimeter pot. I'm probably going to end up putting about 30 or 50 seeds in here, to be honest, just to get a good coverage, get a nice big plant straight away. The advantage of putting lots of seeds in is you're going to get at least something germinating, and you're going to straight away fill the pot when they germinate. Whereas if you have just a few seeds, it takes quite a while for the pot to completely be filled by the plant. So I'm just going to scatter them. You can either just tap it out of your hand like this, or you just kind of you can sprinkle the seeds on the surface. You just want an even covering. So once you've covered your compost with a thin layer of seeds, I would say, as I say, you can kind of see the spacing there. It doesn't need to be too thick, but evenly scatter the seeds over the surface. A pot about this side, about 30-40 seeds should be fine. But as I say, when it comes to chives, the number of seeds in the pot doesn't really matter too much, because if you grow them too close together, they don't really compete with each other too much, and they'll be fine. So there's a couple of things you can do here. You can either cover it with a thin layer of compost. Now if that's a bit tricky to get a thin layer, because you don't have a riddle or a sieve, or maybe your compost quite clumpy, then the other method you can do is you can just get some cling film and just cover the surface. That way it traps the moisture in, stops the seeds from drying out. And you just want to cover the seeds probably about twice their depth, so probably about half a centimetre, something like that, of compost. That's all you need. They don't need to be covered very, very heavily. They're very small seeds, so they don't have a lot of energy to push through and grow. And then once you've covered up the seeds, you then want to carefully water them. I would recommend soaking them in water from underneath. So put your pot in a bowl of water, fill it up about halfway with water, and let the water slowly soak in. If you just water it straight on with a watering can, because the seeds are quite small, the seeds need to get washed away by the watering can, so it's best not to disturb the soil until they're starting to root. Once they've rooted and they've started to grow, then you can water from above, but it's just best to let it soak from underneath if you can, just to make sure the seeds aren't disturbed. Now when it comes to growing the chives, they're quite tolerant as well of different light conditions, so I would just put them somewhere that's quite bright. Avoid midday sun if you're in a hot country. If you're in a quite cool country or it's not summertime, then give them plenty of midday sun. That's not a problem. Also, when it comes to temperature, keep it slightly on the cooler side. So 15 to 20 degrees Celsius is ideal. Most houses are 20 degrees Celsius, so that's quite good. But if you are living in a slightly warmer house, put it in a cooler position or keep it out of the sun just to make sure it doesn't get too hot. They are temperate plants that don't like to grow in hot tropical conditions, so bear that in mind, keep it a little bit cooler. Once they start germinating, make sure they get plenty of light. They can handle a bit of shade, so if you don't have a really sunny position, it's not the end of the world. You'll still get chives growing quite happily. They just won't grow quite as quick or quite as healthily. Also, the leaves often flop over if there's not enough light. So keep them somewhere nice and bright. Make sure the compost doesn't dry out. When they're germinating, they're quite susceptible to dry conditions. If the soil dries out, they'll die off quite quickly, so make sure the compost stays damp. And once they're actually growing up as little plants, you can let the compost dry out a bit more, and the plants should be okay. Just be quite careful when they're first germinating. Otherwise, once they're established, they're quite tolerant of a bit of dry weather. You'll notice if they are getting a bit dry, they'll just go limp, but as soon as you water them, they should perk up again. It's best not to let them do that. Keep it constantly damp if you can, and just make sure that it doesn't get wet in the compost. If the compost gets wet and there's water sitting underneath the pot, then the roots could rot off, but generally chives like it quite damp. They don't like to dry out too much, but if they do dry out, they don't really go to seed too quickly. It's not like some plants like lettuce or radish, they'll go to seed and you won't get a harvest. You'll still get a harvest, the plants just won't grow quite as well. If they do become quite big plants, you might get some flowers in the future. The flowers are attractive, but they can detract slightly from the energy of the plant in putting into leaves. So cut them off if you don't want flowers, but I normally let them flower. They don't take out a huge amount of energy from the plant, and it does look quite nice. And when it comes to cropping the plant, you can start harvesting them almost straight away. You can cut them when they're just a few centimeters tall. I would recommend letting them grow probably about 5 or 10 centimeters before your first harvest. The reason for this is when they're very young plants, if you cut them off, you haven't had opportunity to put any energy into their roots. So if you cut them off when they're very young, they might die and they might not come back. Whereas if you cut them off once you've had a little bit of time to establish a root system, they should come back no problem. And chives are quite good. They look like grass and they grow very much like grass, in that you can keep cutting them back and they'll keep regrowing. And then you can cut them as hard as you want. They normally just keep bouncing back, and they'll keep giving you a good harvest. And the only time you can overdo it with harvesting them is if you cut back a plant. I would always try and cut back a different section of the plant, because it might look like you have one plant. You might think of it as an individual chive plant, but you've probably actually got about 20 or 30 individual tiny plants. So if you keep cutting that same plant back every time, it's going to die. So keep cutting different sections. Basically cut off the tallest growth. Don't cut it back if it's only just starting to resprout. You need to give it some time to recover before your next harvest. So just cut a different section as you harvest it, always making sure that you're not cutting back the same plant every time. And if your plant ever seems to be slowing down and getting a bit weak, I would give it a liquid feed. I normally liquid feed chives once they're established, so I would leave it a first couple of months before you feed it, because there should be plenty of feed in the compost. But after the first couple of months, give it a liquid feed. I would go for a feed high in nitrogen. So if you have a look in the back of the feed packet, it's the N number should be higher than the P and the K number. That's the nitrogen number. So make sure it's high nitrogen. High nitrogen levels encourage lots of big healthy leaves, and it's the leaves you're harvesting in chives, so it's the nitrogen you want to go for. And that way you should have a nice plant, lots of energy in it. It should grow really quickly for you, and you get lots of leaves. And then if your plant does start to get weak, after probably about 6 months or 10 months, it probably needs a dormant period. Let it go dormant outside, and it should come back stronger in a few months' time once you bring it into the warmth. If you can't let it have a dormant period, I would just probably throw out the plant and re-sow some new seeds, and then those seeds will grow well until, again, 10 months come and they need a dormant period. So that's all for this video. I'm now going to leave you guys with a time lapse. I'm just going to put this on the time lapse camera, and so you can see the seeds germinating and see how they grow. When it comes to chives, as they germinate, it's quite easy to tell if it's a chive or not. It basically just looks like a blade of grass. Quite often the seed will come up as well on top of the blade, so you can see it's the chive seed. The only thing you can confuse it with is grass. So if you are growing it yourself, I would recommend trying to get compost. If you can, that's sterile, doesn't have any seeds in it. If you're using soil from your garden, which is suitable because they grow in a wide variety of soils, just be careful that you might get some grass seeds in there, and so it's very hard to tell the difference between grass and chives. And so what you might do is you might start ending up harvesting grass instead of chives when it comes to picking your plant. So try and use sterile compost if you can, because once the grass gets in there, you just can't tell the difference and it's hard to remove it.